Hey everybody, welcome back to the Personal Transformation Podcast. I'm going to have a strange conversation today. I never thought, like if you asked me in a million years when I started this podcast, would I ever be talking to somebody about mythology and historical stories that are kind of transcending time and taking messages through the ages? I never thought I'd be having this conversation. I thought I'd be talking about bodybuilding and how much protein we'd be eating and those kind of goal challenges and stuff like that. But saying that, in my book, I wrote a lot about archetypes and our self-image and how we see each other. And lately, in a lot of coaching conversations, just conversations in general, this concept of archetype has come up a lot. And so I've invited Allison Stieger to the show because Allison has, I'll let you do the kind of background stuff, but a degree in mythological studies and how that ties into psychology with a massive focus on archetypes and how we can use those for transformation and change. So Allison, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here.
Like I said, this is not something that I thought I would happen, but the more I think about it, the more excited I get. Just for context, and I mentioned it just before, I also play Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this is not something that everybody knows about me, but it's something I'm super proud of, even if it is a little dorky. And I have a character, his name is Damir Warcleaver of the Warcleaver clan. Obviously, he's a cleric necromancer, so he's trying to do good, but he's also got all these dark skills. But the reason I say that is because whenever I play Damir, I'm a character. I'm a different person inside my head. And I think differently, I try and act differently, even if it's only within the context of a game. And this is what I think, and I'm hoping that we're going to have a conversation about, is that archetypes change how we think about ourselves and how we imagine ourselves. And if we can do that accurately and effectively enough, then our behaviors and decisions change. That's kind of my thoughts on archetypes and self-image. How did you get into studying this? What was your kind of route into thinking, this is going to be really interesting to study?
Well, it's interesting. It really does go back to the very beginnings of my life. My dad was a small child when World War II started. He lived in Central California, and he spent a lot of time when he was 4 or 5 years old watching the planes fly out over into the Pacific Theater. And he became fascinated with aviation. And by the time he was in his mid-20s, he had become a pilot. And when I was a year old, he moved our family to Alaska and he became a bush pilot. And he was such an incredible storyteller. Like, he really did. He understood story. He understood how to tell a story really effectively. And his stories were very mythic. They were about bears, like coming face to face with bears and crazy adventures and crashing airplanes and all this craziness going on. And Alaska is itself a very mythic landscape. It's got these giant, like, Middle Earth type mountains in them. And, you go out into the wilderness. I mean, there would be bears in our yard. I mean, it was a regular occurrence, right? So I had this kind of storytelling based childhood. And then my mother was a big reader. She taught me how to read at age 3. And I started to really enjoy reading and immersing myself in story on that side of my life. So I had all this kind of storytelling input coming in for me. And, they went through this really terrible, very mythic divorce when I was 5. And story was the thing that kind of saved me from all of that pain. So I kind of swum in the seas of story, if you will, from a very young age. I could see that it was helping me. And I wanted to understand why that was. Like, what is it about stories that are so compelling for us as human beings? Like, we really need them. Like, if you want to tell anyone anything, you need to tell them a story, or else it's just really not going to compute. Like, what is that about? Like, why is that? Why does it make sense to us to tell each other stories to communicate information between humans? So when I got a little bit older, I studied literature, and when I was about 30 or so, I discovered the work of this guy named Joseph Campbell. He had written a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces that you might have heard of. Maybe you haven't, but he posited this idea that we have a common pattern in mythology called the hero's journey, and that this is essentially a story of transformation. And because humans go through transformation so much, we are called to hero's journeys. We are expected to do this over and over and over throughout the course of our lives, beginning even with the moment of our birth, right? Like, we change from one state to another very profoundly and deeply and forever, right? So we do this over and over, and all of these stories that are encapsulated in mythology give us a blueprint for how to manage those moments, right? We have to do it. We are called to adventures. We refuse these calls. We go through all of these things. We have allies, we have villains and enemies that we have to fight against. We have people that are helping us and people that are hindering us. And we come out of it on the other side. And myths capture this, right? They tell this story over and over and over again. And they do that. Those stories last for thousands of years and they continue to resonate because it is such an essential aspect of human experience. So for me, I found that very compelling. Like, mythology encapsulates literature, storytelling, it encapsulates psychology and religion and how we make meaning as human beings. And to me, all of that was so fascinating. And once I kind of got a hold of that idea, I could never let it go. And I still haven't. And it still gets me up in the morning to this day. And I've seen the power of it in changing people's lives. And it really is a deeply effective tool to help us figure out what it is that we need to do when we feel stuck or lost or without purpose in our lives. So
I love the hero's journey as a framework, and I put that in the book as well.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have a fun conversation. I didn't realize how closely aligned I am with the kind of mythology space, but we'll go with it. Let's dive in. But I think for me, the hero's journey is such a fun part, and there's so many examples of it. And I love watching movies. There's nothing better than I love sitting down and watching a hero's journey type one. And the one I use in the book is not the more traditional one, but it's actually Free Guy with Ryan Reynolds. I've got a closet thing for Ryan Reynolds. We'll talk about that. But again, it's this idea that we kind of go through life just drifting, and then something happens and we try and fight it, and then we're like, oh, go on then. We have to kind of go in, and then hilarity ensues, and we come out on the other side of that person. Let's kind of look at that then. So a lot of people. So the first part is the trigger. This is what this, and we're talking a little bit about my next book, Unstuck. What is the trigger for most people? Because a lot of people just stay stuck and they're kind of drifting through life. In the movies, it's fun because somebody arrives like Gandalf on a horse and says, can you look after this ring for me for a minute? But in real life, that doesn't happen. So how do you find people can get started on their journeys? Or what is it that needs to happen to kind of kick off a hero's journey for most people?
Well, it is really interesting because we have a couple of choices. We have the choice of transformation, or we have the choice of mere survival. And a lot of people do choose to just survive. We have a step in the hero's journey called the refusal of the call. And this is when the journey or the adventure you're called to it and something will happen. Your spouse says, I want a trial separation, or I want a divorce, or you go to your doctor and they say, well, I've got some news for you, or your boss calls you into their office and they say, well, we're cutting back. These things happen, that you are thrust into a transformation that you may not be really very excited about, right? And these things happen. You don't have control over them. You get these moments where you're called to an adventure. And, I work with the idea of being stuck often in my own work because it does happen, right? People refuse the call and they say no. And sometimes all that is a moment of hesitation inside the mind. And then you're ready to go, right? You are ready to step into that change of life that's going to happen to you, this death and rebirth that is going to be coming to you. But that doesn't always happen. Like, sometimes people are stuck in that place for decades, right? They spend their entire life saying no to the thing that they need to step into, right? And the reason is because it's scary, right? It takes a real courage to embrace that heroic archetype, right? And I would like to say one little thing before we go too much farther with this. Now, we talk about the hero's journey. That's a very common phrase that's used. In fact, this particular pattern is so common in mythology that we actually, another word for it is a monomyth. We call it the monomyth because it is such a regular pattern. But one thing that I've done in my work recently is I have changed the phrasing a little bit to call it the heroic journey. And the reason that I do that is because when you talk about a hero's journey, as Campbell did, it's very masculine centered. You do kind of put this masculine word in the center of it. And then you kind of beg the question of, well, what's the heroine's journey? How is that different? Well, and I kind of want to bypass all of that. And the reason that I like to say heroic instead of hero is because then it's an action. It's I'm going to make a choice to do this thing instead of I am assuming an identity. And people might not be quite ready for that, right? Like, I don't want to identify myself as a hero. I'm not a hero. I'm just a regular person, right? I am an NPC or, whatever, right? So if you say I'm a hero, maybe you're not quite ready for that, but well, I'm going to make a small heroic choice here. I'm going to take a little bit of courage for myself. And I'm going to stop refusing the call and I'm going to step into the next part of the adventure, right? So I think it really does shift the perception just a little bit. And often when we work with myths in the context of individual human lives, what we're talking about is shifting perception. Like, I understand my story to be a certain way. Well, it can be really, really powerful to change the way we tell that story to approach it mythically, to look at it in a way that's going to like provide you with a different angle on how you've perceived your own life for this entire time. And so yeah, so I do think it matters. That slight change in the way that it's phrased makes a difference, at least for me, in the way that I work with it. So
I completely agree, and actually I can see so many reasons why that would happen. And like you said, I'm not a hero. Like at the beginning of every journey, we don't feel like the hero. The hero doesn't feel like the hero. The hero doesn't even realize they're the hero in the movie. That's the thing. They're just kind of going about their thing. And so if we ask people to step into hero mode immediately, then that's when imposter syndrome comes in, and that's when it's like, I can't do this. This is overwhelming, and I'm likely not going to do it. But like you say, turn it into a verb as you do something heroic. You take something that's slightly outside your comfort zone. I think that's a really nice distinction on that. Go on.
No, I was just going to say that what it does is it gives you just the smallest little entry point into that space. And I know we're going to be talking about archetypes a little bit later, but what you're doing is you're starting to pull that archetypal energy toward you, and that is serving itself as a kind of ally or help or assistance or just support that you're going to need in order to take the next step. So, it does start to do that for you as well.
So you talk about archetypal energy and kind of pulling it towards you. What does that look like? How does somebody start to step into a new kind of frame of mind?
So before I say that, before I answer that, can we assume safely that your listeners understand what an archetype is? Do we need to define that or talk about that for a moment? Let's
give them the Cliff's Notes version, because obviously we've kind of got the psychological version. We'll go there, but we talked a bit about self-image. Give everybody a good rundown. Let's start from baseline. In fact, treat me like an idiot, and we'll be safe.
I will be delighted to do so. Well, the way that I like to describe it is I think of archetypes as being the energy that sort of accrues around any type of typical human experience. So you can almost say that an archetype is any noun that you might use to describe a way of being human. So you can talk about the mother archetype or the child archetype or the king or the hermit or the hero or the ally or the villain or whatever. All of these words have a certain amount of archetypal energy because, it builds up over time, right? And we've been doing this human being thing for a really long time. So we kind of understand what that means. Like maybe you had a bad mother, maybe you had a good mother, but you understand how that's different energetically from being a hermit or from being a hero or whatever, and there is a lot of overlap between them. And, the way that I work with archetypes is rather than kind of thinking of them as discrete silos of behavior or understanding, I really do think of them as being very fluid and things that kind of move around and shift all the time. So I have children, so part of my day is holding the mother archetype. Sometimes I hold the child archetype for my own mother or the wife or, the friend or, all of these things are overlapping all the time. And once we start to understand that while we are on our own heroic journeys all the time, we're going through that in different parts of our lives, we are also holding space for other people's heroic journeys. And we need to understand the ways in which we're showing up for the people in our lives in that way, right? So if we understand that we are an ally over here, or we are a temptation away from the path over here, or we're the villain in this story, right? Like that starts to give us this really wonderful context around how we're interacting with the other humans in our lives, right? And it gives us some really good insight in how to manage those moments. So.
Okay, great. That's a great summary. And actually, I like how you say that we play multiple archetypes, even though in our head we might just be playing one. How we interact with other people. Right. And I'm a father of a 4-year-old going on. She must be like 28 or something like that. She's definitely in rebel phase. But when I'm podcasting, and I like to add in an adjective or something before just to kind of make it. I'm the gracious host. I try and be the gracious host. But definitely in her story, I'm the big bad wolf or some kind of evil villain of something to rebel against. So I think that's funny. So okay. So how can we start then? Like you say, if I've got this identity and I think I'm this, but I need to pull on some different level of energy to help change my results or do something different. How do we get started? How do we do that?
Well, I do think that there are ways in which you can invite that archetypal energy into your life. So if you are starting out on a heroic journey, you can, through, maybe a guided meditation or just, doing some creative work that's inviting it in, there's ways you can invite that in, but you can pull that toward yourself, right? You can say, okay, I have to go in and have this meeting with my boss, and I'm really scared about how that's going to go. If our minds are really powerful tools, right? So if we pull that intentionally onto ourselves, we have now created a kind of armor and protection, and almost like not a weapon because you're not turning it against other people, but what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to take all of the accrued wisdom and power and energy of the warrior, and I'm going to walk in and I'm going to, or the advocate, and I'm going to advocate for my team because that's what I really need to do. So you might be scared as an individual, fragile human being that's on the inside of all that. But you can actually pull that in and say, okay, I'm going to embody that right now. I'm going to walk in, and it will profoundly change the experience you have in the room. It really will. And I would encourage anybody listening to just give it a try. If you have to do something that feels scary to you, anything, find a noun that feels like it can be helpful and invite that archetypal energy into the room with you. And you can put it down when you're done. You don't have to hold it permanently, but it really will help you. It will fill you with the courage that you need in order to do the hard thing that you have to do. It's really very effective. I do this all the time, right? Sometimes when I have to talk to people and I don't want to have a conversation, just inviting, like pulling that energy gives you this kind of protection, and it allows you to do the hard thing that you have to do. So
it's like when I play with Dungeons and Dragons, the way I act as a cleric necromancer is very different to how I would act in a more professional setting.
I mean, wouldn't you say that character is holding archetypal energy for you, and it is meeting a psychological need that you have, right? There is a space in your life that you have created in which you can fully embody that. And this is what Dungeons and Dragons is so brilliant at, right? It allows you to go in and kind of play in this sandbox of different archetypal energies that you can create by writing these characters for yourself and creating these narratives. And that's going to carry out into your regular life. When you're having to be this archetype for your 4-year-old, you're going to borrow some of the courage that you have from that character when you play D&D, and it's going to help you manage that situation. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm going to add it here. We could do this with words, right? We could say, I am brave, I am courageous, and all of these things, but it's going to take so long. It's going to take so long. And this is why I think, and we'll come into the classic archetypes in a moment, is when you say mum or you're the mother, I immediately know what that is. Like inherently, there's something that's kind of passed down, like you say, I don't know if it's through story or interaction or whatever it is, but when I think mother, I think so many words I can't possibly express so quickly. And that's where the power is, right? We can say, oh, I need a bit of this, I need a bit of that. But if we're able to kind of take something that holds so much of it all in once, then
I would almost like say physically move your body, like pull it onto yourself, right? I'm reminded that there's this great TV show, Ted Lasso. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's this great scene in there where this woman, she's the head of this, she owns this team, right? And it's Hannah, I can't remember her last name, but she's this wonderful British blonde actress, right? And she does this thing where she goes like, oh, and they're like, oh my God, you're so amazing. We're gonna go conquer Europe now, right? Like she almost literally does it on camera. It's almost like she's pulling that archetypal energy, and I think of that often. So I kind of do that myself. Like, okay, I'm gonna pull this big energetic thing onto myself, and now you are bigger, and you are braver, and you are scarier, and you are more powerful than you were a moment ago. And then when you're done with it, you can just put it down, right? You don't need to walk around like this all the time, right? Like you can, in fact, borrow those energies when you need them.
And that's it, right? We're just borrowing energy. We're not this person. And this is, we'll talk about transformation and how we can slowly become that person, but we're using it as a tool and as a technique in a moment where, like you say, we need to feel courageous or we need to act a particular way. And, you've said we're stuck. We're in a situation where we want to create change. Most change is scary, right? If we look at our life, it's, I want to do something differently. I don't know if I can do it. There's an element of comfort zone. So, if I'm trying to get outside the comfort zone, let's kind of talk about some archetypes that are fun, right? So, other kind of dwarf necromancers and the mother, if I need courage, like what would be some cool archetypes that I could play with that would give me that kind of that sense that I can go and do something a little bit scarier?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can approach this. Now, you can just take those noun words, right? Like you can say, well, I need the warrior, or I need the advocate. I need to be the advocate for my team, or I need to help heal someone, so I'm going to bring the healer energy in, or whatever. So you can approach it that way. Another way that I talk about archetypes is in the context of celebrities. So we have celebrities, and they tend to accrue an enormous amount of archetypal energy around them because they are holding that for other people, right? So if you see a celebrity, whether you hate them or you love them, they are going to hold, so we just had this election in the US. Donald Trump was elected president again. And I find this guy really interesting, right? Because you either you love him or you love to hate him. But what I believe is happening with him is he is holding something that's very much like the trickster archetype, right? So a trickster's purpose is to break up calcified areas of power in a culture. So, and they always live around the edges of the culture, right? So he could not get elected from the presidency. He could only get elected from the outside, right? I find that really interesting, right? But our culture as Americans, we see this kind of government that we don't like the way that it works. And there were enough people that thought that this trickster energy that he was holding archetypally was going to be able to successfully make real changes. Now, whether you agree with that or you think that's true or you don't, he is holding something that's very much like the trickster, right? Now, what we see happening too, though, is, and I want to make this point, is if you are inside of an archetypal energy for too long, it can be enormously psychologically weighting for the person. It can really do a lot of damage. So you have to be careful. If you are holding the archetype too much, it can break you. So this is something you very much want to borrow for a little while and then set aside and then move into another one, because you're going to constantly be shifting among these. But you see this, like celebrities, all this stuff kind of accrues on top of them because they're so publicly known. And people break. I mean, they have addictions, they have suicides. I mean, all these terrible things happen. We have this long history of our artists having issues with this type of thing. And this is, I believe, the reason is because their celebrity has created too much archetypal energy around them that they can't figure out how to manage that small person that's on the inside. I do believe that Donald Trump is actually identifying a lot with his archetype. And there are interesting things psychologically happening to his person that's on the inside of all of that. He's benefiting from that archetypal energy. He's gotten elected now, but also there are interesting psychological consequences of some of that. And you can see people either managing that well or not so well, depending on how much support they have among their own individual personal life, right? So, we have to be careful with this. This is big, big energy. It's powerful. That's the benefit of it, right? We borrow it for a little while, but we also have to respect it a little bit and say, okay, I gotta just have this temporarily and then put it back.
Yeah, it's fascinating actually. You said the Trump, and I find him an interesting character. I was watching the election as a spectator with popcorn.
Yeah.
And again, for me as a Brit, we just had something very similar happen in the UK, so I can't say anything too bad about it. But you mentioned there he can't be elected from the inside because his whole play is that's broken. And if you're inside and you're saying that's broken, it's like, well, you're the one who's supposed to fix it. Get out and get someone else in. But you mentioned something else there, is like the power of energy and not being able to know yourself. Robin Williams, for example, the comedian, was an amazing guy, and he had that so outward personality of being the joker and being the kind of the pleaser and the entertainer. And deep on the inside, there was clearly sadness and dissatisfaction in life. At what point? So let's take that then. At what point do we use this as a tool? And at what point do we try and become the person that is that person? If you know what I mean? So, when we set goals, the reason I say it is when we set goals, we're trying to become a better version of ourselves. That's effectively what it is. And, we create this idea of there's this person over here that I want to become. I'm over here at the moment. I'm not that person, but I want to go on my own hero's journey. At the end, and the story comes around with the same person at the end, but we have all these different tools and experiences. How do we know, or how can we, that's not the right question. When is it us versus when is it us playing a role? And how do we be careful not to extend ourselves too far and, like you say, become the archetype?
Well, okay, so I'm going to answer this by going a little bit sideways. I believe that I do have a really, really solid answer for this, and I'm really excited that you asked me this because I love to share this part. And I think that this is the most important thing to understand about what it means to go on a heroic journey. Now, we have, as I've said, multiple heroic journeys that we're going on throughout the course of our lives. We also have one giant heroic journey that is our entire life, right? So the way that I see it, and this is how I describe it in my own book, right? We, at the beginning of our lives, we have a pretty understood set of goals or things that we want to accomplish, right? We want to like get our house, spouse, job, child, whatever it is, hike the Inca Trail, whatever it is that you are really attached to that you want to do. Everybody kind of has a set of like a little bit of a to-do list when they start their adult lives, right? And that is kind of the beginning part of the life's heroic journey. But there is a thing that shifts kind of in midlife. Jung does talk about this as well. He pinned it at 35, but that's not the age for everybody, right? It's when are your children growing up? When have you accomplished a lot of your career goals? Or maybe you've got, you've kind of ticked a lot of things off your list. So that is a part of the heroic journey. And then you kind of have this moment where people do sometimes lose their purpose when they've done all of that ladder climbing at the beginning of their life. What do I do now? What am I meant to do? And the best thing to understand about going through the heroic journey is that everything that you are going through will in fact benefit you. You are going to be transformed by this experience, but it is not the only thing that matters. What you are doing is so we talk about it in 3 stages. You separate from your community, you are initiated by going down into another world, and you come back out and you return. Now you have to, you've met allies, you've defeated villains, you've defeated the dragon, you've gained the hoard of treasure that you have to at the bottom of the journey, but you now have a treasure, you have your wisdom, or you have your thing that you need to share, and you actually do have an obligation to return to your community with that thing that you've learned and share it on with somebody else. So I've talked about how we have these great stories from our ancestors. That's what myths is. People told stories and they lasted because they resonate psychologically. So the people that came before us did this. They went through their hard times, they shared what they learned. And what we're doing in the process of this heroic journey is we're learning from those ancestors, and then we are in fact becoming the ancestors that the next generation needs, right? So you in fact have an obligation to share back, to become a leader in your community, to share what you've learned. So we are moving toward a more spiritual side of life because now you have this incredible treasure. And if you don't share it on, if you don't find a way to bring that back out into the larger community and to help somebody else start their own heroic journey, you in fact turn into the dragon that's in that you're hoarding. You've defeated the dragon, and then if you don't share it on and do the next step, you can, that's the second state of refusal. You're going to turn into that yourself, right? So that is, I believe the answer is you can borrow this archetypal energy. You need it. But if you try to hold on to it for yourself, then you are going to turn into a monster. So this is the most sacred thing that human beings do, in my opinion. You take all of this pain and all of this suffering that you've gone through in order to transform, and you share what you've learned on with the next person that needs it. And if you can figure it out, if you can contextualize your own story in that sense, you're gonna go on and you're gonna write your book, or you're gonna start to make art, or you're gonna, share what you learned in a conversation with someone. If you can do that, then you have completed and gone all the way around through the heroic journey, and you have done your sacred duty.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Interesting. I couldn't ask the question, but the answer was perfect. This is the fun thing about these things. I'm learning so much stuff as we go through, and I'm trying to come back up the other side and come back up to sharing the knowledge. Okay, so I'm on my heroic journey. I've started. Mm-hmm. I've kind of figured out there's some archetypal energy I need to get, but I get a little bit lost. Like you talked about stories and how stories have some sense of truth and history, and it sounds like we don't have to make all the same mistakes that we're facing this, and it always feels like it's our challenge. Like nobody's ever been through this stuff, but I'm sure people have. How can we be smarter? How can we learn from these kind of mythological stories? Is there anything that we can do to kind of use them to our advantage and take the lessons and apply them? Is that even possible?
Well, I mean, that's exactly what I do with my work. Like I consider myself to be an ally, and I'm certainly not the only person that you can learn from, but I would invite anyone to just start to read myths, right? Like everything is in there. It may not look the same. You may not go on a boat called the Argo, and you may not have to defeat the Trojans, or you may not, whatever, right? You may not be turning into an 8-legged horse, or whatever it is that you're doing. But the psychological underpinnings of those myths are still very relevant, and there are myths from all over the world. There are thousands and thousands of them. You can find the one that resonates the most for you. And you can read a myth and, it sometimes has a little bit of archaic language or whatever. And I consider myself to be sort of a helper to help people figure out what the psychological underpinnings of that are. But they're all there, right? Like this work is, these stories have been, I consider myself to be a facilitator of helping people to access the thing that they've had all along, right? Like these stories have always been there, but we just don't really have the tools to learn how to figure it out. So I can help with that. There are other people that can do that, or you can just go in and let your intuition guide you around seeing what a myth has to say to you. And they're so brilliant because they can, they're very large stories. Sometimes they are capturing cultures, but you can go even to one line of a myth or even one word of a myth, and it will tell you something really interesting. Like there's a particular myth that I love to work with. It's called the Descent of Inanna. It comes to us out of Mesopotamia, and it's about the goddess Inanna, who is very similar to Ishtar or even Aphrodite. She's kind of the goddess of Venus, all this, and she decides to go into the underworld and she's killed down there, and she has to give up a lot of who she is, and then she has to get it back at the end, and it's this whole thing. But the first line of that myth says, Inanna turned her ear to the great below. So she is, in the first line, she's deciding to go into the underworld, and that is not her space. She is a goddess of the heavens. But these myths come to us from cuneiform that's stamped into clay tablets that were found in what's now Iran, right? So if you look at that cuneiform character for the word ear, it is the same as the word for wisdom, okay? So just that by itself, okay, she is turning her wisdom toward this thing that she needs to go on, this journey that she needs to go on down into the underworld where she is going to be transformed. She's going to die and be reborn. And all of, the wacky hijinks ensue throughout the story, and all these things happen. And it's moving and sad and colorful and wonderful and hilarious and romantic, and, all these things are going on. But there's just one word there. And it really does open up like a flower for us to show us what it is that we need to learn next. Okay, so, and you can do this with just about any myth, right? Like go and find a myth that you like, anyone, and meditate on it and see what it has to tell you. That's the thing that anybody can do. You don't have to contact me. You don't have to follow my social media or go to my website or anything. You can just go to any myth at any library in the world or online. There's a lot of myths free online, and try it out and see what it has to share with you, because it will tell you something.
You mentioned about reading and how important that is. My daughter just started reading this week. It's the craziest, most surreal thing. Like, we've been looking at letters. Now all of a sudden she brings over this piece of card with 3-letter words on, and just starts sounding it out and making 3-letter words come together, and then put some 3-letter words together. And she's reading like 9-10-letter words. I'm like, how has this suddenly happened? And the school has this idea that stories unlock your future, and I have to laugh with my surname always on that, because the secret of success is story, and I'm like, Libby, listen.
Yeah, that's right, it is.
But she's reading, and we're reading with her a lot of the kind of the classical Disney stories and the kind of fables of those kind of bits and pieces. There's lots of stories that have come historically that have been really good. We're also reading some kind of modern ones where they do, like you said, it's not the hero's journey, but they're starting to put different characters at the front and taking the lead. Is there, obviously there's some ancient ones that kind of come from, historical texts, etc. Is there any modern ones that you've kind of connected with? Is there any kind of modern stories?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at anything that's really popular, the reason that it is because it has mythic underpinnings, right? If you look at Harry Potter or the Marvel movies, or any of this stuff, like even those Marvel stories, they have Loki and Thor, and they're right, like they've got these underpinnings of mythology that are right there. Watching this Loki character in the Marvel universe has been so fascinating, because his arc is incredible, right? He's villain and hero and back again over and over. And that's a very Loki kind of characteristic, because he's a shapeshifter, right? He changes to female and male, and, and he's into animals, and, all these crazy things are going on. So, I think that whatever story resonates for you, you don't have to go back and read the Iliad. You don't have to do any of that. You can find any story. And if you start to recognize what archetypal energies are being held there, once you get more comfortable with this kind of work, they start to open up to you, right? And you really do see what is going on psychologically. Now, your daughter doing what she's doing, she has a real psychological need that she's trying to meet, right? She is trying to make sense of this world that she finds herself in as a 4-year-old child. My son did the same thing when he was learning to read. He was determined to crack this code, right? He wanted story. And he's now a 15-year-old author. He's writing novels, but he wanted his way in to understanding the world of story because it is so compelling. Because what are stories? They are ways to understand the world without having to live it yourself, right? So if you hear a story about somebody that went through something like what you're going through, you can get a little bit of a clue on how to handle it. And that's exactly what we're talking about here, right? Like, this is why stories compel us so much. You know, why this is how humans communicate. In order to understand something that another human is saying, you need to hear it in the form of a story. And anybody that's sat through a dry meeting with a PowerPoint that has a lot of data in it understands this, right? You're going to immediately start tuning out and thinking about the juicy bit of gossip you just heard from the break room or whatever, right? Like, you're going to find the story somewhere, even if you have to go to it in your own mind. And if you don't know how to tell a story and you have to communicate to someone, you're going to lose people. So it's a very understood, I think, by most people, at least intuitively. You know, and this is what we're doing in this conversation, right? We're telling stories. You're sharing about your child. I'm sharing about my child. Like, we're making it accessible to the people that are listening, right? And we have to do it this way. This is just how humans communicate. And we do that because it meets a psychological need. So, okay, I might have lost the thread of your question. I'm sorry, you can go back and catch me up. I would appreciate it. So I got caught up in my own story.
The questions are merely a prompt, and the answer is always is my thought as a podcast host. We're kind of coming to time. I'm sad. We should make this into like a 7-hour episode, just a mammoth epic. I'd be very happy with that. But let's kind of see if we can summarize some of the key points.
Yeah, sure.
So I've listened to this. I'm at a point where I'm like, right, I need to do something. I've got this idea of archetypes, and I want to get some energy so I can have more something. I don't know what it is. It's courage or ambition or whatever it is. What do I do first? What's the one thing? Like, how do I access this energy? Take me through a quick process that would allow me to access that.
Well, okay, so I'm a really big believer in introducing ideas into the mind and then physically moving them energetically through the body. Like, every time I teach anything, there is an element of movement of the physical body, because as I've learned in teaching my workshops, you know, I can tell any myths and, you know, do all this storytelling and teaching and whatever. I can introduce it here, but if you don't pull it into your physical body, you're not going to really fully understand something. So I'm really big about, like, okay, say, let's just use this as an example. You have to have a difficult conversation with your father, and we're having a Thanksgiving holiday here in a few days. That there's a difficult conversation coming at you, and you know that. So what I would invite you to do, if you're facing that, is to think about what it is. Like, say, I like that word advocate. It's a fun one, because it is a way that we show up for other people. Or, you know, maybe you need to be an ally. Okay, I'm just going to make up a story. So say your niece has come out to you as queer, and you know that you're going to have to support her in that moment. And you know your dad's not going to handle it very well. So what are you going to do? How are you? And you're scared. Your dad intimidates you. He always has. What are you going to do about that? Well, you can pull some of these archetypal energies. And I would actually suggest that you physically, don't just think about it, like physically move your body, stand up and say, you know, like kind of do this like movement, like that you're going to like invite that in, right? And it, you know, and it feels silly. And anytime I do rituals with people, which I do all the time, it always feels really silly, right? We're not used to having rituals. And, you know, mythology and rituals really are two things that go together, because for that very reason I just described, you need the body movement in order to make it make sense. So you can tell all the stories that you want, but you need to ritualize it into the physical body. So, you know, people do these rituals in order to make that happen. And that's been being done since the beginning of time. So find a way, like you can just, you know, move your hands like this, right? Like pull the energy of the universe of that archetype into your body, invite it in for a temporary visit, bring it into you before you walk into the room, and then do what you have to do in the conversation, and you will find that you have more of what you need from that archetype. It actually will work. I know it sounds crazy, but it will work. You will borrow that. And then what I would suggest that you do afterward is let it go, like intentionally ritualize the letting go of that energy. And it's a really small thing, but it will make a difference. You will find that you have the thing that you need. You will have borrowed that successfully, and then you let it go when you're done. And that energy is ready to be used by the next person who needs it, right? So it's that same thing that we just said. You borrow it for a little while you do the hard thing, and then you let it go and you release it back into the universe.
I love that. And for those of you who don't, like, not sure, I'm imagining now putting my necromancer cloak on, and I'm going to be even more Airmere in the next thing. But this is just, if we look at the psychology, this is just anchoring. Like, if you kind of take away that aspect, it's just anchoring. And so, it could be, and I've got in here, and I'm just kind of going through my drawers, but it's never accessible. But little things like this, right? Little pins or something like that, or a ring or a piece of jewelry that you just put this on in the moment, or play with it, or like those little wristbands that say certain things, like the old Livestrong ones. Have those things that allow you to step into that moment, and then, like you say, when you finish with it, just put it down until the next time.
And this is what a talisman is, right? Like, you can, in fact, take that energy and not pull it into your body, but in fact put it into an object. And this is very supported mythologically, right? Like, this is a sacred object. This sword has power. This ring has power. This crown has power. This cloak makes me invisible. Like, all of these, this is what you're doing, right? This is what that is capturing in the story. Yes. And then you put it down when you're done with it.
Okay, so there you go. The talisman is the way forward. Allison, I feel like we just got started. But this has been amazing. I'm looking forward to taking on my heroic day as part of my heroic journey, as part of this conversation. I am absolutely certain people are going to want to know a little bit more. You mentioned the book you do. How can people stay in touch or get in contact?
Well, okay, so my website is called mythicstories.com. I would invite anyone to come along and join me. We've got retreats, we've got classes, we've got coaching available. There's, follow me on social media at Mythic Stories, and I share a lot of content there for free. I mean, if there's really any level of involvement, the book is coming. All of this stuff is in there in much greater detail with much greater tools to help you navigate all of this. So if you're interested in this, if it resonates for you, please find me. And, you can, if you want to talk to me personally, you can absolutely do that. It is free. You can schedule a call with me and do that for a few minutes, and we can see if me as an ally for you is something that makes sense. And I'm just here for everybody. I really do love talking about this. If you kept me going for the next 7 hours, I would love it. But we don't have that kind of time today. So unfortunately, we have to say goodbye now. But I would invite anybody listening to please reach out. I would love to talk to you. This is my favorite thing to do. So yes,
this is now one of my favorite things to do as well. It's book my story. So I'm going to go and do some reading. I'm looking forward to bedtime with Lily later. Today, Allison, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and for helping us all tell and live better stories.
Oh, you're very welcome.